All right, so we're ready. Thank you for your patience. Thank you all for joining this month's EPSP Connects installment. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Annette Eltner from TU Dresden. Dr. Eltner is a professor of, and my screen is not changing fast enough, geosensor systems at Dresden, where she leads a research team advancing photogrammetric techniques to study hydrological extremes and fragile landscapes, focusing on high-resolution data to improve soil erosion modeling. She serves as chief editor for Geoscientific Instrumentation Methods and Data Systems and aims to bridge the gap between geodesy, geography, and autonomous environmental monitoring. So at the end of the session, we'll be doing a Q&A. Feel free to post your questions in the chat as they come to mind. Hai Chin, Shashank have joining me as part of the EPSP Connects team. They'll be helping out with the Q&A session at the end. So Dr. Eltner, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the introduction and also the invitation. Yes, I'm very happy now to give you a bit of an insight what we are doing in our group here in Geosensor Systems. And correspondingly, the title is now maybe a bit fancy, but the idea is really to show you a bit in which kind of field of applications we are using our methods. So AI-driven 4D photogrammetry for autonomous environmental monitoring. And before I start with the actual case studies or insights, I would just like to show you a bit what in general the aim is of our group. So what we are trying to develop or which kind of research questions to answer. So it's all about geosensor systems, as you can guess, and especially to look at across-scale research questions in the environmental sciences, basically providing improved observations and then how to use these kind of observations to also advance the modeling or the environmental models themselves. So these are the corresponding research foci, so smart geosensor networks, 4D observations, which I also will talk now about today, and data processing with AI is just an element which is now necessary for most of our steps, and all the way to how we can actually use them, then our data which we derived, also including them into the actual models. Okay, good. Now, I brought basically four different studies for which I would like to show what kind of methods we develop and in what kind of scenarios we are using them. And one topic will be in regard of camera gauges. Then I will talk a bit on how we use, for especially these 4D change models for soil erosion measurement and also modeling. I will talk about riverbank erosion. And at the end, if there is some time left, also how we use the methods for landslide assessment. And now I will go ahead and start with the first topic, which is on how we can actually use specifically cameras to improve flood assessments. So the idea is, of course, there are lots of methods already available which we can use to map flood events, but each of them come with some disadvantages as well. So for instance, for the case of stage estimation, there is already you can use like these traditional gauging sites where you have, for instance, pressure gauges or these like meters to measure the water level. However, they are quite expensive to maintain, or also you would have to go and read these levels. So that's why they are not really at all the sites. So usually more on the larger rivers. However, if we go to especially towards flash flood events, we would actually need to have them also on the smaller catchments, but they're just not feasible to put everywhere. And now the idea is, can we actually use cameras which are cheap, depending on how you define it, but which are usually quite cheap to acquire and also to set up and use then this data to get the water level all the way to flow velocity and at the end to the discharge. And I will go now here step by step through the different processing steps. So the first one is for the water level estimation. So the idea is actually that we can use, as you see here now on the right in this image, like really cheap cameras, like a Raspberry Pi camera with some computers attached to it. So you can flexibly control when you take the data. You can also process the data even on site and then only transmit the results. So it has to be as low cost as possible. And then we need some other things like ground control points. I come back to that later to be set up and measured. And then the idea is to capture now an image, for instance, every half an hour, or even later event controlled, so only then even continuously, but only when it happens, for instance, when a flash flood is coming along, and then capturing the data and transferring it. And at the end, using some kind of image-based approach to automatically extract the water level. And the idea is now, if we can do that, but we need some prerequisites to do this kind of processing. The first thing we need is like a good 3D model of the river reach, which we are monitoring with our camera. So you can now see here 3 examples for 3 sites at which we did install these cameras, and then we used, for instance, drone data or also handheld cameras or handheld or pictures captured from the ground, and then we use the standard structure for motion photogrammetry to derive these 3D models. So this we have now, and the methods are now quite established. In the next step, what we then need to do is we have now these images captured in a specific interval, and each time we need to basically assign within the image where is water and where is no water, basically masking the water pixels. And to do that, one thing we did here was using basically some convolutional neural network, and we tested different variants and different ways of doing some data augmentation. But at the end, to get indeed also with quite limited training data, reliable, like above 90% reliable extraction of these water masks. Nowadays, we even extended it to such a degree that we don't even need training data anymore. We can use one of these so-called foundational models, and also with them quite reliably get these water masks. But of course, if we have this mask now, we still don't have the water level yet. We're still in the image with our measurements. And to really get from this water mask to the water level, the next step is now that we have to know from which kind of position and orientation did actually the camera capture that image. And to do that, we now use ground control points, right? We know their coordinates in the same coordinate system as also the 3D point cloud of the whole river reach is given. And then, however, to use then these ground control points with our images, we need to automatically detect them also in the images. And usually you have some movements in the cameras or some change of the camera geometry in general. So this has to be done automatically indeed in each of these images. And what we therefore did, in addition, we also now used some AI approach to basically automatically detect these ground control points. In this case, it's like a bounding box detection combined with some key point detector. And on the right, you can actually nicely see how these ground control points moved within the images because of some camera movements. And you can nicely see that there is some systematic shift basically of the camera. And however, the important part is we can now reliably, even if vegetation is growing, as you can see now in the upper part, we are still able to detect that ground control point, which is not possible with some more established like template matching approaches. And now we have these ground control points as well. We have the 3D model as well. And now we can, with these ground control points in the image as well as in the object space, we can use some standard photogrammetry to now estimate from which kind of orientation and position was the image captured, which you can now see here in this illustration. The idea is now if I have the orientation and position of my image, and I have the image itself, where we now extract only basically the polygon lines, because this is our border between water and the shore, and we use that line and intersect this one now with the 3D model, which we captured right at the beginning. And by doing that, we can actually get now for each point in the image along the water also the corresponding height value from now the 3D point cloud. And here's now an illustration, as this is now possible to do basically in real time and continuously. As you can see now here, the colored points are actually the 3D model projected back into the image. And you can see the red line there in the back, which basically now shows us how the water is rising and falling again. And we have the computed water level. And you can also see in comparison to some reference water level measurement, we are usually within a few centimeters of accuracy. And of course, now come more extreme cases where it gets more tricky, where it does fail, if you have snow cover and things like that. But in general, under normal observation conditions, we can quite nicely now and robustly get the water level with the system. So coming back to stage estimation, I would say, okay, this specific aspect is solved. And now the next step is we would like to also get the flow velocity. And of course, although there are established methods already available, so you can use this kind of spinning wheel, or you can also use some tracers. But now, since we have our cameras already set up anyway, the idea is why not just capture in addition a video and then using that to get the flow velocity as well from the same system. And one option you can do is using this called a particle tracking velocimetry. There's also other approaches like particle image velocimetry available or optical flow. But what we use now here is particle tracking velocimetry. And the nice thing is we already have our water area because we only want to track the velocities in the water. So we can narrow down already now our search region and take now this water mask, which we already have available from our previous step. And then in the next step, we do detect some particles automatically on the water surface. There are actually algorithms available from the 80s still, and they also still work quite nicely with our data. And we would use those, for instance, some corner or blob detectors to detect now these particles. And then the next step we have to do is basically take these particles, consider a bit their surrounding as well, and take this basically as a template and go into the next image and then search there for the area of the highest similarity and to basically find then the location where we say, okay, this is now how far the particle tracked from one frame to the next frame. And yeah, so this is the idea. Again, these kind of algorithms, they actually also go back to the 80s and still work nicely also in our approach here, as you now can see for a few frames. I think it was now 20 frames of a video where we detected these particles and tracked them through the video. However, so far we are still in the image, so we don't have any information yet in like a meter per second. We only get the velocity now in pixel per second. So again, what we need to do is to come from our image space into the object space. Since we already know how the camera was oriented and positioned from our previous steps, and we now also know already the water level, we can basically take each of these image observations and directly intersect it with the water surface and thereby get the information. I can skip that. And this is the result then at the end. So we get to some velocity in meter per second. And as I said, for the flow velocity, so far these algorithms are still this kind of old school style, but nowadays we also advanced that to using AI-based tracking, which makes it even more robust, and we have to do less parameter tuning at the beginning of the setup. I come back to that later when we talk about the landslide topic. Okay, so now we have the flow velocity measured as well. It works also fine. And then in the next step, I would like to go the final step, of course, since water's level or stage as well as flow velocity are just some intermediate step to at the end to really get to the discharge, which is basically the wetted cross-section area multiplied by the flow velocity. And yeah, coming to this step now, of course, we can do just the average cross-section or the cross-section across the whole river, but usually the more complex the river is and the more complex your cross-section, you would actually prefer to do some further binning. And this is what we basically did, as you can see now here, that we don't just use like one average flow velocity for the whole cross-section, but actually subdivide it in smaller bins and getting a more closer picture to the discharge by doing this kind of approach. And you can see this on the upper right part, basically you see these bins. And in the lower part, you can see then basically just one velocity for each bin. And what you also have to consider in this case is, of course, as you can see in the upper image, there are some regions or some bins where there is no velocity information given, for instance, because no particles were flowing at that moment of observation. And since we have, however, our cameras now set up at these kind of locations, they can monitor now, of course, through a long period of time. And you can actually go back in time to see maybe in a previous instance at the same water level, there was some tracking possible, and then use this kind of information for closing the gap. And this is what you can see. I hope you can see my mouse. This is basically this image. It looks a bit like a velocity profile at different water depths, but it is actually really the surface flow velocity just at different water levels. So each of these values here, or these raster cells, correspond to a surface flow velocity just at different water levels. And this we can now use to basically close these gaps and basically get a bit more holistic idea on these flow velocities, and then in a second step also on the discharge, which you can now see here as a comparison of in orange is the discharge of a reference, which we did here, compared to the optical approach. And we really get quite close to actually the reference by this binning approach. If you wouldn't do this binning, we would be quite far off, but with this kind of binning and closing these gaps, we can actually use the full information across space and time to get a better discharge estimate. Okay, good. So this would be now in regard of how we can use these cameras for observing rivers and getting discharge information. And the nice thing also now we can take this to any kind of river, and as long as the cross-section is stable, we can use that to go all the way to the discharge. And now I would like to shift a bit the focus and now going to the case study or the application of soil erosion measurement. And here, again, we use photogrammetry and having images captured across the time from different positions. And this is now an example or some motivation why we would like to do that in the case of soil erosion measurement. And in the next step, then also soil erosion modeling, because of course, soil erosion is a quite complex process. And at different scales, we see different kind of erosion forms. And usually we have observation approaches which are valid at different scales, but usually not across the scales. And so if you want to then also better understand the physics, which are important across the scales, we need some kind of observation, which allows us also to look at the change of the soil surface at different scales. And the idea is now to see if we can do this with these image-based approaches. And here you can see now this setup for the microplot. So you can see on the right side, so here in this green box, we have cameras set up, and these cameras are now triggered, in this case, every 10 seconds, and synchronized triggered every 10 seconds. And in addition, we do some rainfall simulation experiments. So this is with artificial rainfall experiments, as you can also see here, a scheme of that setup. And at the bottom, we also measure, of course, some sediment yield and runoff as well. But the most important part, which we are now focusing on here, is what can be derived from the camera observations. And then, as you can see now here, this is just from one image, but already this image tells us nicely something in regard of the settling of the soil as soon as we have the start of the rainfall event. But now we take it a step further, that we just don't want to look at one image, but actually combine several images with structure for motion to get a 3D model. So having a 3D model every 10 seconds. And this you can now see here. Again, it's a similar setup, just a bit larger area, which is now rained upon. So here again, we have our artificial rainfall simulator. Here we have the cameras, and that's the area of interest that it's looking at. And now we can see here the average change of elevation every 10 seconds. And now here we can also see it spatially resolved, these changes. So you have here the height change every 10 seconds. And we can nicely see now how here a rill is forming and then propagating up the slope, as well as at some point the hill on the right side stops, and this rill on the left side accelerates and now causes most of the erosion on this plot. And so basically we have now a 3D model of change for every 10 seconds. And the idea is now to use this kind of observation, combining it with erosion model, and to basically see is any of these models, are they capable to predict these kind of patterns at the soil surface, and not just spatially, but especially also across the time. And this is now an example. In this case, we used the model RILPRO, which is a physics-based model, specific, as the name already suggests, specifically focusing on rill erosion. And what you see now here is the example of, we did a lot of different model runs, in total 2,500 runs with different parameter constellations. And at the end, none of these 2,500 runs could really well predict what we've seen in the field to what is predicted by the model. So none of them was really able to capture it as very nicely. So telling us, okay, we have now the observation to take that and look where at which kind of specific aspect are these models failing, and how can we now change them and adapt them and improve them in the future. And we also realized by doing that, it's actually, we also have to come up with new ideas on how do we compare what we observe across space and time with such high resolution and what the model is actually predicting. And what we also can do, since we have now this very high resolution changes across space and time, we can also use now these called 4D object by change detection algorithms, which basically also just look at the data. So it's also only data driven, but you automatically identify events and look basically how is my point changing through time. And then you look, is the neighborhood changing similarly? And this helps us actually to detect indeed events within our time series. And by doing that, you can see now here in this image, we are actually just by automatically looking at these time series, we can automatically identify, it finds again these rills and these regions of interval erosion. And this is completely data driven, but it only works because we have this high spatial temporal resolution data available. Okay. Another nice thing is also that we can use the images not just for the 3D change, but also actually looking now at coming back a bit to the river topic or to the water topic more precisely, that we can also use it to segment the water which is now forming on the plot surface. So we can actually use this observation as well to get some idea of the ponding on the water surface and also identifying now the moment when is actually when are these ponds connecting and when do we really have the start of runoff actually on our plot. And this is what you can see a bit on this animation on the right side, where we have in blue this water area and in green the number of ponds. And you can basically see at some point that these ponds are connecting, and that's when we start to see actually the runoff and not from the beginning. So this is another thing. We can also use this kind of observation to feed it also into these erosion models, as this is also one important aspect they try to capture. Okay, now I was talking about we would like to do these things for some upscaling ideas. And of course, we can now use these camera setups, which we used for these small plots, the same setup, but now taking it to the field scale. As you can now see here on this image, we have now 5 cameras up here, and we have actually in total 3 like setups with 5 cameras each. And then we developed a little own setup where we can control the system. And in this case, with a rain gauge, which allows that only when it rains, it captures images. So I don't use, I mean, of course, when there is no rainfall, we are not interested in images, but as soon as it starts to rain, especially if it starts to rain heavily, I want a lot of data. And this is now triggered by these camera gauges, allowing us to capture really only the data when we need it. And now this is where you can see how that works on the right side. Already just having one image again, we can actually identify or see how the runoff is actually forming on the soil plot. And yeah, seeing already the preferential flow passes. And again, also in this case, we are not just interested in this image for just having a look at it, but also in the next step to, again, calculate these 3D models. And now you can see here, this is basically a daily model of change shown here throughout a whole year. In total, we calculated it for over 4 years, but this is now just shown for 1 year. And you can see each time when we have this blue bar here, this is basically when the soil had been reworked. So we had some, how you call it, a tractor basically plowing the soil and basically resetting it back to 0. And then we can look at the change again from that point. And we can always identify nicely, of course, because of the soil reworking, we have some loosening and we have some settling again. And then also because of rainfall events, further settling, and then including again erosion. And this kind of a data, since we have it on the small scale and then also on this field scale, allows us, for instance, to calibrate the models with these small scale observations and then to see how well is this actually transferable to this kind of field scale and to see in what kind of issues we run here if we go across the scales. Okay, good. So this is now for the soil erosion topic. And now I'm coming to another field where we used, however, the same ideas, but now looking at riverbank erosion. And this is specific with colleagues in Finland together, where we studied this specific riverbank here. And it's like the situation is that we have more clayey material in the bottom and sandy material on top. And we have correspondingly here some groundwater also leaving, or like some seepage effects. And on top, usually smaller little landslides happening. usually during rainfall events. And the idea is now to use this time-lapse setup to better have a look at when are these events indeed happening. So again, using that to disentangle different processes which are involved here. And so this is a setup. So this is basically where we are located here, very far in the north of Finland. And we have now here these kind of very cheap, because this is also, I think, quite nice, that we can use very cheap wild cameras to do still photochrometric reconstruction for geomorphological change detection. And so in this case, we set up these 4 cameras and we put them upon these beech trees here. So also very simple in the way of how we put it here. And then we also put up some ground control points again for the scaling. But at the end, specifically what we did here, we used the same kind of photochrometric approach, which we also used for the soil erosion, but now extended it a bit more, since in the last few years we've seen quite some advance in the AI-based photochrometric approaches, which makes it now possible even in situations where beforehand, which you could see here on top, where we were not able to actually align images. Now with these AI-based approaches, even if the images are very challenging, we are able to use some algorithms that allow us to align the images and again then compute 3D models. And I want to show now here an example where we see this is a time-lapse image for the year of 2023. And we can now see on top, this is how you would use we used to do it. The 3D reconstruction, again in blue negative changes and in red positive changes. And on the bottom, now with our a bit AI enhanced approach, and you can see that there is less noise basically in our data now present. And what you can also nicely see as these events here, that we can actually now identify local events of erosion and accumulation, and also some more gradual changes, and allowing us now to really go in the next step, have basically also compare it now, for instance, with soil moisture and other aspects, to then really disentangle at what kind of time, in a point in time, which kind of process is happening. And this we already done here for some first preliminary assessments. And you can see now on the right side very nicely basically some hotspots of negative changes as well as positive changes. So we can basically identify which kind of regions are most active in the riverbank. And if we then also look through the times here, like through the whole summer season in this case, we can actually see during this spring season, because of snowmelt and water level rises, we have higher changes, and also the thawing of the riverbank, then less active period in between, and then towards the end, this is more regarding noise in the data series. But we can now actually really use this kind of information and to get a better insight in what's happening here. Also, in this case, basically every 2 hours. Okay, good. And then I think in the last 5 minutes, I will also give now an example where we use, in this case, just one camera, but also using it for some geomorphological assessments, in this case, to monitor a landslide. And this is a study of a colleague, or together with a colleague, where it was important. This is in the Alps located, where we have a landslide and also a rock glacier below. And which was very nice here at this situation is that there is already a long period of time where observations had been made, for instance, using differential GNSS and also some UAV monitoring every once in a while. And in addition, what we were interested in, there was also a webcam situated, which again frequently took images of this area of interest. And now the idea is, because at the moment this image was only used to basically have a look what's ongoing, but actually really quantify what's ongoing. That's where we use this kind of observations. And now you have a bit closer look at it. So we have here a webcam installed, and another one is installed here, and looking basically at this landslide region and the rock glacier here below. And as you can see here in green and purple are basically some observations which had been made before already, as well here also some observations, but within the most active regions, no observations are available because of course, it's quite dangerous to go there and capture any kind of data. And the idea is now, well, since the cameras are looking there anyway, and we do know how we can actually scale information within our images if we have some other observations as well available, why not do this here as well? And to get indeed image on how this landslide is moving throughout the years, as well as the rock glacier. And you can now see here just some time lapse of both of these webcams where they're looking at. So here again, the landslide here on the left side, and also here towards the rock glacier on the bottom. And what we did in this case here, we now, as I was talking before on the rivers, when I was talking about flow velocity and this particle tracking velocimetry, this was more the old school approaches we used. But now here in this case, it gets a lot more tricky, and also because it's not really as easy to distinguish a particle floating on a dark surface as with the river. Here you have a lot more complex terrain given, and this particle tracking does not really work in all these scenarios. Also, for instance, sometimes we have a fog, and in this cases, we don't really well see the site. And so in this case, what we did, we used the so-called PIPS. So you can see basically this is already the results of this PIPS approach, where you basically just really feed the image, and you can nicely automatically identify the regions where we do have some movements and the other ones which are more stable. And this PIPS approach had been introduced 2023. And as said before, it's in this it's nice in regard of that we also don't have to tell it the algorithm. So what is the search window? How far do you have to go in which kind of direction? This is all done automatically. And what I think is even more impressive, this model had only been trained on completely artificial data sets. So in this case, the so-called flying chair, and had basically never seen like a landslide or rock glacier, and it still quite nicely worked already in this environment. And then again, this is the first part. So we still have our measurements only now in the images. And again, we want at the end some meter per whatever period velocity information. And what we did then here in the second step is using this so-called giraffe tool, which basically allows us to, as you can see now here on the second slide, on the next slide, that if we have a 3D model available, in this case, it's a 3D model which was reconstructed from the UAV flights. If we have a 3D model available, we can use that to calculate synthetic images and align that to our actual captured image, which you can now see here. So this is the image of the webcam. This is some synthetically rendered image from the UAV point cloud. And by having the UAV point cloud, I already have the 3D information. And this allows me immediately to align and get the position and orientation of our image. And in the next step, as we did with the flow velocity, intersecting it again with the 3D model and getting then some movement of our particles originally in the image and how much actually does it move in the object space. And this is now the result, where we would indeed get a velocity per meters per day in this case, here in the landslide area, as well as in the rock glacier region, and also zoomed in a bit here in the landslide area. And on the bottom, we get some velocities now plotted in blue is actually this average velocity meter per day. And then we have the validation in red, which was basically measured with a theodolite, where we looked at specific points and then compared that to our approach. And we get actually quite, of course, it has to be a bit carefully done because we cannot exactly use the same point as was measured with a theodolite. But in general, our velocities are comparable. And the nice thing is now we don't just use 1 or 2 points, but we get a more complete picture how the both of these landforms are moving through time. Okay, and I think with that, the 40 minutes are over, and I'm, I think, done with my presentation. And I just wanted to give finally, of course, say thank you. Since this is was not my sole work, but actually a big collaborative effort to get these different results. Yes, and I'm now looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. We already have questions. Let's see. We'll start. Colton Elkin, excellent talk. What are the power requirements for the stream gauging Raspberry Pi camera setup? Would it be feasible to remotely deploy one of the wildlife cameras that you used in the riverbank erosion?
Yes. So for the Raspberry Pi, maybe to say that we have the system running autonomously also in other sites. For instance, we also use it for Wadi observations in very arid environments, and there we have them completely autonomously running. but of course, there you have also the advantage you have solar power, which you quite nicely can use there. But in general, these, if you take care of the power management in a smart way, you can use them really autonomously. We are doing this as well. And for the wild camera, in this case, that makes it even easier because it's really just a simple camera with some simple AAA batteries inside, and then they run for depending on how often you want to take the images, but in this case, they do run for 3-4 months before you would have to exchange actually the batteries.
Hai-Ching, do we have any more questions?
Yes. Madison asked, really inspiring talk. I'm curious if you used ground control points in the soil runoff monitoring and what tool you used to complete your change detection maps.
Yes, yes, for the soil surface, that's a good point. There, it indeed was very necessary to have ground control points because for the soil surface change detection, the idea was really to go as close as possible to millimeter accurate change detection, and this only would work with ground control points. And so we basically had like poles up to 0.5 meter length, which we drilled into the ground to ensure that they stay as stable as possible. Also considering shrinking and swelling movements. And so, but if you have these setup, you have to take this time and basically the effort to do that. But then you can really go towards millimeter accurate change detection. And for the what kind of tools for the change detection maps. So basically, in our case, most of the things I've shown here is all own implementations using Python and corresponding libraries. But there are actually now really nice libraries specifically also for change detection. So one would be Py4D which is a very nice comprehensive library, specifically also for these kind of change detection. So when you have already the point cloud, in regard of to get towards the point cloud, this is all own implementations. Some of these have been published now with some of the work I've shown here. So basically coming with the paper. And the more improved one, which I've shown on the last slides, where we use the AI-based approaches, we are now in the making of also making that soon available openly, that everybody who is interested in it can also use it.
Right. The next question from Alejandro Tenorio. Great talk. Are these models live measurement ready?
Yes, I hope I tried. I see if I understand it correctly. So if the idea is if we would be able to basically get the 3D models in real time and then for change detection. We are not there yet to really do it in real time, but this depends a lot on basically what's the resolution of the image, how many images do you have, what kind of power of computing do you have available? Would you have maybe even, can it do parallelized on strong PCs? Then actually you would be are now also be available or be able to do it in real time. I do think it's possible, but you would need quite some resources there and yeah, setting it up in a smart way to do it this way. However, it has not been the need in our case yet. But I think, for instance, if it's just stereo 2 images, you can go already into real-time change detection for that. Yeah.
Right. Hai-Ching, please text the next question. Take the next one.
For the riverbank work, are you considering adding any vegetation and determining erosion of the bank under different planting scenarios?
That's a very good point, I think. And no, here we are not planning that. But yes, for sure, you could use this method to also, we've seen that quite nicely. We can automatically extract the vegetation and also look basically on the biomass increase over time. And of course, that's actually quite nice and interesting aspect then to look in the second step also, how is it, for instance, stabilizing or at some point even failing again? Yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Well, we wait for maybe another question or two from the audience. I'll ask one myself. You mentioned just recently computational cost. You've been working on this kinds of topics for a few years now. How do you see, computers are getting more powerful, but then algorithms maybe are also getting more involved? Do you see that, is your time less, more efficient, or, it's not keeping up? Like the algorithms are just more and more sophisticated, and then you continue to need a bunch of resources.
So meaning that the you have more and more algorithms available, but they also more and more require more intensive
Potentially, right?
resources.
If you train your algorithm, training,
Yes,
for
yeah,
example, for any of these
yeah,
networks might take a lot of
yes,
resources. So
yes,
where do you
exactly.
think it sits? Do you think you're doing
Yes,
things faster now, or is it taking pretty
yes.
much the same?
No, I think it is for sure. It got faster. So with these kind of resources, of course, there's a point of training is usually the part which does need a lot of resources, but we try to also actually go and use already trained models and just do a bit of the fine tuning, not really this very power hungry running forever idea, but actually trying to see if there are models already available which are working in our domain as much as possible, and then doing just the last bits basically. And for that, it got faster. So these kind of water extraction, for instance, beforehand, we would really stack the video frames together and basically add up the regions where we have a lot of change versus where it's more stable. This was a lot more, would take a lot more time to now just run it, and also trying to use networks with less parameters as possible to also make it run fast. Yes, so it is. At the moment, I think we are faster in regard of the processing, but another, I think a good point is as soon as you've done to solve it for your case, already there is a new network or two or three out again, already 5 steps ahead of where you started from originally. Yeah, though maybe for this, it's more tricky to keep up with these kind of advancements and to see what works still in your case. Yeah.
I think there's another one there.
Okay, Marco asked a very interesting talk regarding the water stage topic. What are the algorithms used to automatically recognize ground control points and segment water bodies? How much cameras in situ did you use to get accurate 3D model, and what type of structure from motion algorithm did you use for processing?
Okay, yeah, thank you. A few questions. Yes, so for the ground control point, this was done basically we used we adapted a neural network for a bounding box detection, and then in addition some key points within the bounding box, which originally was actually developed to basically see how people, like the pose estimation of people within these bounding boxes, and we adapted it now to just look for one key point and then detect basically the center of a ground control point. That's what we used here. And for the water bodies, it's the same. We used basically convolutional neural networks. We tested different variants. And at the end, it turned out it doesn't really matter which kind of network we use. It's a lot more important how we augment the data. So the training data augmentation was the more important aspect. And now went so far that you can actually use now these foundational models, for instance, such as segment anything model, and you just say extract water, and it draws automatically a bounding box and extracts the water surface. And so we don't even have to use training data anymore for that. And how much cameras to use for the accurate 3D model? In situ, so I guess for the soil erosion or for the riverbank, we used like these 3 and up to 5 cameras, and in some scenarios we have maybe 8 cameras. But for the 3D model, which we used for the water level, we basically used a standard structure for motion flight of a drone with a drone across the river reach, and then used that for the processing.
All right, Dominic Amschwan, concerning the Mattertal landslide rock glacier, is it possible to estimate from the webcam images volume changes in addition to velocity?
Yeah, that would be nice. That would be actually the other thing of interest, but this is actually not, at least thus far, not really possible, because with just one camera, you don't get the 3D information. You would need the second one. So the depth information basically is not possible to really reconstruct. What you could, but this goes way too, it's absolutely not clear if that would work, but there are now basically these mono-depth models available which try to estimate the 3D from just one image. Maybe you could try something like that here, but I would be very careful how much that goes really towards guessing. So thus far, really volumetric change, you would actually need, in the best case, a second camera. and could try with, as said, with these monodes ideas, or there are some others going towards 4D Gaussian splitting. Maybe you could see at least to get some idea of change, of volumetric change. But further than that, I wouldn't say. I think you still need the second camera to do that.
All right, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you, Dr. Eldner, for a great talk. Forgot to mention this at the beginning. Thank you to Dr. Mareike the vet who invited you. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here. She had to attend to some work in the lab at this time and couldn't make it. And thanks to, to the EPSP team for, coordinating, making sure that the website is up to date. We've got a talk coming up in May as well. Shashank or Haishin, if you have the details, please go ahead and share those briefly with our colleagues.
Yes. So for May 20th, it's Dr. Brady Carson from University of Houston. She will talk about shifting. The title is "Shifting Sands: How Humans and Climate Keep River Deltas on the Move." So I will host that talk next month. I'll send the flyers soon, later this week.
All right. Thank you all. Yeah, stay posted for announcements on our next installments.